All right. Hi, everybody. Can you see my screen okay? Cool. I'm going to go ahead and take a couple of random volunteers to get this conversation going. Feel free to phone a friend. Alex, what is dry and why is dry important? What did you and your group discuss? We have Alex here. Okay. Let's do some of this. Izzy, same question.
Hey, don't repeat yourself, and it's very important not to, because basically you want like others to look at your code and just find it, like straightforward, and you don't want to actually they're both kind of similar. I like to tie both together, but I'll tell you more about dry. Um, when you don't repeat yourself, it's about like was it you the empathy, user empathy, or developer empathy, is that what it's called?
I think that's what I hear you describing, because I really like what you mentioned about wanting other people to kind of understand the code that you're writing. I don't know
Yeah,
if you have more to expand on with that.
yeah. No, that's pretty much it.
Well, developer empathy code should be readable to anyone working on it.
Mhm.
Awesome. I'm going to keep calling on some people because I think there's probably a lot we could say about this. And I think we'll add in here that maybe there are some things we could say about both dry and SRP, and we'll try to like organize these notes before we move on. Can I hear from Lee? On dry also, anything to add to this? What are some other advantages of adhering to dry principles?
It can make your code run faster. More efficiently.
Can help code performance and make things more efficient. Cool.
And I just add also, on the efficiency side, makes error solving easier, since if you have one method that's being used in multiple places and it's erroring out, you only have to fix it one time.
Yeah, very good point. So makes debugging easier. This means if something goes wrong, we only have to fix that bug in one place. How else can I say that? Repeated code means bugs need to be solved in multiple places. Does that capture what you were saying?
Yep, perfect.
Awesome. We can definitely come back to dry if anybody has more thoughts on this, but let's hear a little bit about SRP. Brian, what did you and your group talk about for SRP and why it's important?
So single responsibility principle, and basically just that you want small methods that only do one thing.
Awesome. Let's keep building on that. I think that's a good place to start. Elliot, anything to add to? I'll open it up for these next few, either adding to SRP or dry. Anything else interesting that you talked about? Would like to add to this?
I feel like it's kind of similar to like the make debugging a little easier is nothing kind of you don't have like as much going on in one method, so it's a little easier to fix if something was to go wrong, since you're not kind of doing more than one thing at once.
Absolutely.
And makes coding less lines of code.
Smaller, more succinct, or succinct, is that how you spell that? And specific methods make them easier to understand and debug. Great. Yeah, I'll open it up to everybody, and I'd love to hear from somebody who I haven't called on yet today. Anything to add to either dry or SRP? And while y'all are thinking about that, you can go ahead and raise your hand, but I will put down here, I think developer empathy, this whole point can probably be applied to both. Maybe there are some other things that can be applied to both, but I think this is pretty central. Dane.
Yeah, I think maybe it prevents certain like methods or classes from like kind of becoming tangled and like having multiple different like files or like folders dealing with the same thing.
Sure. So would that apply to both of these concepts in your mind? Would that be?
Yeah,
or were you
I would say so, but probably more for a single responsibility protocol.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. So single
as it
responsibility
pertains.
principle, you were saying, sorry, can you repeat what you said one more time? I want to capture it accurately.
Yeah, just that having like a single responsibility protocol makes it a little easier for code to not like be repeated, but also like get kind of tied up in a way. I don't know a better way to say that, but just so that you don't have like kind of confusion between two different files or two different folders, you kind of have everything like isolated and tidy in one file or place.
Yeah, also, I think that's right. And the phrase that comes to mind is like, you don't want unrelated code to be too closely coupled to something else, right? Yeah, awesome. Let's go to Sammy.
Kind of going off of what Dane said. So when you stick to the single responsibility principle with classes specifically, it makes them easier to test.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that can be especially relevant to classes, but I'll just put here that this, let's say easier to test code in isolation. I think that, yeah, that's super accurate. Thanks, Sammy. Matt.
I raised my hand immediately when you were talking about developer empathy, because I just think that's a cool arena to explore. Drawing up your code and using the single responsibility principle are definitely very interrelated, and to try to connect it to developer empathy, you have to realize that everyone's coming from a completely different perspective. And so by removing the necessity for excessive interpretation from how someone else codes versus how you code, it's the readability aspect of code is actually way more important, I think, than we might think about while we're coding. And it's the reason why refactoring is often necessary, I think. So that's just, it wasn't a connection I was considering when I was discussing it with my group, but that's, it was a pretty cool insight that you made.
Awesome. Yeah, I think those are great points. I think a lot about teams and how teams work efficiently, and like how many cognitive resources people have to consume just to understand each other, or like go through just to understand what the other person's working on. And I definitely agree that if we try to start from a place where we're not repeating ourselves and where every piece of our code has like its own responsibility, then that's less for the other people on our team to parse, right? Cool. I think this is a really good place. This is pretty thorough, I think, for these concepts. And I wanted to open up with this discussion and kind of get that thought process going, because as we talk about this design pattern of model view controller and Rails conventions, a lot of them do have to do, a lot of these concepts do have to do with making sure that each part of the code has a set responsibility and we know what to expect when we go into different parts of our Rails app, and just kind of, yeah. This is why we have a framework like MVC to organize our code with. So a lot more we could say here, but let's jump into a few slides and then, yeah, we'll go from there. So yes, Rails uses the MVC paradigm, and this breaks responsibilities into three major components. The model is responsible for interactions with the database. So if you think back to yesterday, we talked about databases and ORMs, and how our ORM active record will translate raw data into a Ruby object that is easier for us to interact with. And in Rails, those are known as models. This would be anything, any class that inherits from application record is going to be a model. And typically all of your models are also going to correspond one-to-one with a table in your database. Views are responsible for what the user sees. So when we're working in Rails and we're not connecting to any kind of more robust front end, views are how we present something to the user in the browser. Controllers are responsible for coordination between these two things. So we have this model concept that has to do with data and business logic and all this stuff, and going into the database and finding the data. Then we have views that only have anything to do with what the user sees and presentation logic. And then the controller is what connects these two things and kind of allows them to talk to each other without talking to each other directly. So this is a illustration, a very, very simple illustration and simplified, I guess, explanation of how a Rails app works. So this would be probably a good place for me to pause so that people can take some notes. I won't pause for too long, but I will just kind of go through this again and reiterate. We'll get into more details about how this happens later. But when we receive an HTTP request, eventually that information is going to make its way to a controller. And we're going to have some parameters that will tell us what we have available. And then the controller will do some logic to go get stuff from a model. Model will do data stuff. It will retrieve rows from the database. It might do some math. It just kind of depends upon what we're looking for. Then that data gets sent back to the controller, and the controller can package it up and send it over to the view. What we want to avoid is having these two talk to each other. And if this doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now, that's okay. We're going to get into a lot more detail in this class and later on in the week. But yeah, this is a really key concept of MVC, is that your view and your model don't communicate directly. These things always go through the controller. So you can think of the controller almost as like a traffic director. Cool. I'm going to keep moving on. And routes are the entry point to our apps. So the routes use DSL, which stands for domain specific language. This means that there's a particular syntax that works in the routes file and is designed specifically for the routes file. And at its core, this is a pattern matcher. The routes.rb that you may have worked in, you probably saw in the homework video, right? And in Task Manager. This will map an incoming HTTP request to a controller action. So yesterday when we were looking at HTTP, there were some questions about, well, how do we know what the verb is? And how does our app know how to interpret that? Like, how do we handle these incoming requests? And this is how we're going to start to get into how that all works and how we handle those requests. The routes file is where this happens. And from the routes file, it will go over to a controller. Let's see here. I think this might actually be let me think about this for a second. Yeah, I'm going to go through a couple more slides, and then we'll take a POM in a little while, and I'll diagram this out, and we might kind of revisit some of these points. I think it's really helpful to have a visual of this stuff, but I think it makes sense to introduce this terminology first. So yeah, I'll keep going here. Important things to know about routes are the HTTP verb, the path, and then this syntax of a controller and an action. We'll see this in the text editor in a minute and get into that in more detail. So for models, we need to keep in mind that this is for data logic calculations. What is the shelter with the fewest number of pets? Filtering of data. Return to me all the shelters that do have pets available. That would be an example. Other manipulation of data, like only send me back the names of the shelters, could be one example of something we could do in the model. And this all returns raw data to the controller. It could return Ruby objects or active record objects. It could return just some attributes. The idea is we want to get the data that we need from the model, and then the controller will collect that data and send it over to the view. Views are presentation logic, so very little actual logic or information checking. It's pretty common to have some simple conditional statements in your views, like something like if shelter.has pets, then you would render something. But what we don't want to be doing are things like calling active record methods in the views and stuff like that. So views really should be as simple as we can make them. They are just there to present information, to present data to our user. Using ERB, we can iterate over a data set. So if we have an instance variable, I think this will be easier to demonstrate than it will be to talk about, but just for now, we should know that in the views, we can take a collection of data and iterate over that using ERB. We can actually interpolate Ruby into our HTML. But these are basically the most complicated things that we would ever want to do with a view. We wouldn't want to be doing like nested iteration if we could avoid it. That's too complicated for a view. And the whole idea here is we just want to present the data in a way that is useful and understandable to our users. So that's models and views, and here we have controllers. So this is application logic or business logic. I think of this mostly as application logic because typically when we get into business logic, I've noticed that it tends to kind of get confused with like data logic. But what I want to really emphasize here is that the controller is the go-between, or like a traffic director between models and views. So each controller method knows what models to use for fetching or writing data. It retrieves data and then hands it to the view for presentation. Really should not be doing a whole lot of data manipulation in the controller. That is a job for the model. And the point behind having a controller is to have a place that can fetch data ahead of time and have that all like nice and neat and packaged up, and it will have that ready so that the view does not need to directly call the models. Okay, questions up until this point? What questions are coming up for y'all? Okay, I think we're going to get, it's only 9:24. I think maybe what I'll do is I'll start the diagram, start to give like a very basic visual of what's going on here and how our concept of MVC works in the greater context of HTTP. So let me share my whiteboard and see if I can get that going. And before long here, we will take a break. Can everybody see my whiteboard? Oh my gosh. I can't seem to draw on my whiteboard. Give me a second, y'all. Can everybody see that? Cool, great. All right. Thank you for your patience, y'all. Just trying to get a few things arranged here. Okay, so let me think about this in terms of what we covered yesterday, just kind of orient us in how all this works. We'll do this. So over here, we'll have our client, and then our job as backend developers is to handle incoming HTTP requests and package up and send an HTTP response, meaning that we are working on the server side. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit on what our server is going to look like. And then between these two things, we have the internet. Right. Yes, I'm going to go ahead and make sure I have everything here. So we have an arrow coming here because we start at the client. We go through the internet to the server. Server does some stuff, sends back a response. And I'm going to go ahead and label these things. So here's our client. Here's our server. This is our Rails app. And I think maybe we can also mention how these things are being accessed. So we're accessing the client, or our user really is accessing the client through a web browser. This is going out to the internet. And what is going through the internet on each side of this cycle is the HTTP request and the HTTP response. And then our server, we can access this by like looking at our terminal, right? So we can have a terminal running the Rails server. And that's kind of how we understand that as far as like our development environment and where the action is happening, so to speak. Cool. And just to even like expand on this, like what this practically looks like even more, let's give the example of saying our user wants to go to localhost 3000 and see all the tasks. So that's our example of the behavior that the user is looking for. Okay. Does this make sense so far? Does anybody have questions about this very high level process? Any clarification I can make before we move on? Hopefully after yesterday's lesson, this is feeling pretty comfortable, feeling pretty familiar. Yeah. Maybe I can move these over a bit. I think that makes sense. Cool. Let's go ahead and take a palm here and come back at 9:34. Hey folks, if you are back from your palm and don't have your video on, could I just get an emoji to know that you're back? Okay, we'll give it a second. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Cool. So let's go ahead and keep adding to this. Does anybody remember what we mentioned in the slide deck earlier? When we receive an HTTP request to our Rails app, what is the first place that goes to? You can just shout it out if you remember.
Is it the routes?
Yep, exactly. Routes.rb. So that is the first place that we need to know to look for incoming HTTP requests. Of course, as is a running theme with what we're learning about Rails, there are a lot of things that are abstracted away that we don't need to know the finer details of. So there's some like stuff and magic that happens to get this HTTP request to the routes file. But this is the first thing that we will need to touch in almost every circumstance. So we'll get to the routes file. And then the next thing that we're going to do is go down here to the controller. And in a second, we'll be looking at code examples to talk about how and why that happens. But here we go to the controller. And then after the controller, let's say that this is the example we're working with. Our user wants to go to localhost 3000/tasks. And if it's localhost, that's us, right? We're going to localhost 3000/tasks. And eventually what we want to see is an HTML page in our browser that is listing out every single task that we have in our database. So after we get to the controller, does anybody have a guess as to where our code will go next? And if you want to raise your hand or if you want to raise your hand, we can talk about this a little bit. D.
Does it go to the model?
Yep, exactly. So once we get to the controller, that's sort of our traffic director, right? We have information about what we want to get. And to get any data, we need to talk to a model. Awesome. And then that data will go back to the controller. Actually, let's not do that just yet. Let's draw another box. We'll say, how about right about here? And I'm putting this on the edge of our Rails app, like kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, so to speak, because Active Record, if you remember, is a gem. It's a dependency that we can install in our Rails apps, but it comes standard with our Rails apps, but we can also install Active Record in other Ruby projects, like a Sinatra project. So in order for the model to do its job, we go here to Active Record, which I should label. I'm just going to label it AR for short. And this is like our adapter to go where. Somebody can just shout it out if you know it. What does Active Record get for us? So where does this go?
Is it the database?
It's the database. Thank you. Cool. So Active Record asks the database for some stuff. The database says, yeah, I know how to do that. Here's your data. Active Record goes back to the model with some Active Record objects, the Ruby objects, so they're easy for us to work with. And then the model can send whatever we asked for back to the controller. It might be a whole object. It might be certain information about that object. Not super important right now. Then what I'll go ahead and add here is that the controller will then be able to send something to the view. Let's label the view. And I'm putting you all on the spot here, so I will take a volunteer if you want to raise your hand. If you think back to Task Manager, does anybody have an idea, or even the set list homework that we've been having you do? Does anybody have an idea of how the view gets a hold of the data that the controller is passing it? Like, how do we access that data once we're in an HTML view? This may be a little tricky because I don't think I mentioned it explicitly yet in class, but it is something that I think everybody has already done. what do we use in the view to access the data that we got in the controller? Michael?
Embedded Ruby.
We do
objects?
use embedded Ruby. That's what allows us to call Ruby in our HTML. But more specifically, like what holds that data is kind of what I'm looking for. Corinna, do you have an idea?
Is it the instance variable that we're calling on?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to put here ibars. That was a little trickier. So thank you, everybody. Yeah, so our view is able to access whatever instance variables we set up in the controller action. So we'll look at this a little bit more closely now, I think. I'll leave this up here for maybe a minute or two, just in case people are taking notes along with, and then we'll jump into some code. And the other thing I'll say here is that by a few weeks from now, my hope is that this is very easy for everyone to visualize. It almost becomes like second nature, because this is just a very standard flow of data passing and yeah, just interactions that we can expect from our Rails apps. Having a very good understanding of sort of like the order of operations and the organization of this paradigm can really help with debugging as well. So I will come back, and I will probably come back to this diagram. Either way, I'll be sure to drop it in the code help channel today. But it's probably a good idea to have your own copy as well with any notes. So with that, I'm going to try to share my whole screen to get to the text editor. And let's just kind of walk through this process. So how do I want to do this? I think what I really want to do is have a browser window open over here. Can everybody see my entire screen? Like, can you see my browser as well as Adam? Okay, just making sure. So my user wants to go to localhost 3000 tasks. What is my first problem here? Anybody have an idea? Amanda?
You haven't started the server in the terminal.
Yes, exactly. So I'll do that with Rails S. Cool. Looks like I'm all set. So now I should be able to go to localhost 3000 tasks. And now I don't have any tasks in my database, right? But this is what we are going to start looking at in really close detail. So for the sake of the example, I think I will just quickly hop into Rails console and create a couple of tasks. Okay, so now I should have a task for laundry, and now I should have a task for dishes. This, and just refresh here to make sure that I have the behavior I'm looking for. This all looks good to me. So when as a user, I go to localhost 3000/tasks, could I get a volunteer to identify the different parts of this URL? A brave volunteer could raise your hand. Okay. I'm not afraid to volunteer people. No, I'm just kidding. Marla, thank you. What are the different parts of this URL in my browser?
So I'm guessing the local host is the protocol.
Yeah, that's
portion.
actually, that's a good question. I technically am not totally sure, totally possible. But let's think of all of this as one piece. If we have two pieces to this URL, we'll leave the protocol out of it for now because yeah, that's probably more detail. But like if we have this piece and then this piece, what would you think of them as? Sorry, I keep highlighting them incorrectly. That is one piece and everything to the left is another for the sake of our discussion today. What are these two pieces?
So the piece on the right is the URI or the path,
Mhm.
and then the piece on the left would then be the domain.
Yeah, I think that's great for today. Thanks, Marla. And really the one I was hoping that we could focus on is the URI or the path that's most relevant. Perfect. So we'll say that. And then we said earlier that the very first thing that we're gonna hit in our Rails app is the routes file. So before we go much further into this example, we should spend some time here talking about the domain specific language of the routes file. Cool. So for details on the DSL available within this file, see guides.rubyonrails.com. So this is kind of getting to that point that there is a specific way that the routes file is supposed to be written that we don't really see in other Ruby classes, that we don't see in other parts of the Rails app. This is basically what we can expect here. And we'll get into some more advanced routing concepts later on in the mod. The things that I want to point out about this domain specific language are that we have a verb that starts each line. Then we have a URI or path. And then we have a comma. And then we have this piece, which is a keyword argument. And this may behave slightly differently than other keyword arguments in Ruby, but because it's the routes file. But the key here is the keyword is to. This is basically saying, hey, I want these kinds of requests to go to, and then we pass it a value of where we want it to go. And this string should have a word on the left side and a word on the right side. The one on the left indicates which controller this request should be routed to. The word on the right of the octothorpe or of the hashtag, this indicates which action inside of that controller this should go to. So as an example, I will open up the welcome controller on the other side. And if I were to go to just get localhost 3000, our path would be this slash. And this would match because we'll get into like how to configure these HTTP verbs a little bit more later. But for now, we'll just operate under the assumption that everything we're looking at is going to be a get. So this is a get request and it matches this URI. And because of line 3, our Rails app knows to send this request route this request to the welcome controller index action, which is what we have here. With get tasks, which is the example that we just showed, it matches because we have a get verb. When we type something into the browser and hit enter, almost every time it's going to be a get. Then we have slash tasks. So this matches the path that we put in our browser. Then we have this delineating comma, and then it's going to the tasks controller index action. So that means if I were to put a binding.pry, and again, I'm getting this because tasks controller, this matches, and index method. And when I say, I should mention, when I say action in this context of a controller, action and method are interchangeable. They're synonyms. So the index method or the index action, if I put a binding.pry here and I go back to my browser and I refresh, I should hit that pry because my request has gone to the routes file. It gets to line 5. It says, hey, I know where to send this. I send it to the tasks controller index action. And then when we get here, we have a binding.pry, and that's where I'm at. What else? Nope, that's not what I wanted to do. Cool. So the other thing to note here is that the syntax here is very important. If you have a pluralization error, like if I said task controller index, I would never get to this pry and I would error out. An initialized constant task controller. So the pluralization in this part of the routes file and in your class name, those need to match up exactly. What questions do you all have about the routes file so far? Okay. Great. So let's refresh our memory by looking at the diagram again real quick. After we get to the routes file, we go to the controller. We've talked a little bit about how we match from the routes file to which controller we should go to. So once we're in the controller, you'll see here we have some active record and we have an instance variable set up. and we should look into what exactly this is doing and why we're doing it this way. So when I mentioned earlier that we don't want to be doing a lot of heavy active record in the controller, I'm not referring to like task.all or task.find. These types of things, like the very basic lookups of models, that's perfectly, like they have to go in the controller, right? If you want to retrieve a collection of active record objects and have them available in the controller, they have to be called here. I won't get into like examples of what shouldn't go in the controller yet, because I think that's beyond the scope of today's lesson. But essentially everything you see here is pretty standard for a Rails controller. Having your destroy action also call the destroy active record method, for instance, or having the show action or the show method set up a task.find with some information from the params and assigning one instance variable. This is great stuff to have in the controller. Just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that, because I think it can start to get confusing when we talk about MVC and the different responsibilities of models, controllers, etc. So in order to display all the tasks on the index page, we need to ask our database to return us a collection of all the tasks in the database, right? And that's what we're doing here on line 3. Task.all is the active record call, and then we're assigning it to an instance variable. So this is basically our model going to the database for us. We aren't going to be, in this exact example, we're not going to actually open up the model and define any different behavior. And that's actually something I think that I want to ask you all what you think about. So let's just put this all in one window for now. Sorry, rearranging some stuff. Here we are in the task class, and this is actually from the lesson the other day. So I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of this for now. And maybe it is helpful to have the controller over here. So on line 3 of the tasks controller, we're calling task.all. And I don't see that method def all defined here, or def self.all defined here. Anybody want to share, like, where do we get that method? Why do we have access to this code that I'm highlighting? Taylor?
It is inherited from application record.
Yeah, exactly. We are inheriting from application record. This knows how to do like these basic built-in active record methods. Cool. So at this point, we have our instance variable, and we have the things that we are holding in that instance variable. I think that's all making sense. So the next step, it would be to go to the view. Let's see, how do I want to do this? I think I want the view on the left. And here's an example of what I was talking about in the slides in a little bit more detail. We have this instance variable inside of an ERB tag. Somebody brought up ERB tags being the way that we can access our Ruby objects, which is true. We need to interpolate. We basically need to drop into a Ruby session while we're in this HTML document in order to access this instance variable. And this instance variable is defined in the index action of the tasks controller. One thing that I think can be very confusing at first, but gets easier and easier as you work in Rails, is the convention around how your program, how your application will know which view to render. And the convention is this. Let me expand this a little bit. Oh, come on. Yes. The convention is that your controller will look for the view. Basically, when it gets to the end here, the default behavior is that your controller will try to render a view that matches the name of the method. And it will look for this view inside of a directory that matches the name of the controller. So when we're here at line 3, at tasks equals tasks.all, default behavior after this is to render a view underneath views. So if you look over here in my file tree, I have views, and then it'll look for a directory called tasks because we're in the tasks controller. And then inside of that directory, it will look for an html.erb file with this name. So index.html.erb. And that's how we get to this view. If I were in a different controller called, I don't know, pets controller, then, and I had an index action, then the default behavior of that controller would be to look for views, pets, index.html.erb and render that. So to give an example of what it might look like for that lookup process to fail, let's rename this index.html.erb and try to go to this page. So I'm going to rename it not index. And now if I go to my browser and I refresh, this is the error that you might get if your program does not know which view to render, or if there is not a view that matches the name. So tasks controller index is missing a template for this request and vary it. This is just saying I can't find a view under that name. I actually haven't tried this. As an experiment, I'm going to say not index for this action name. And that means I'm also going to need to change it in my routes file so it knows where to route this request. So tasks not index. Cool. So now if I refresh this, will it work? It works perfectly. So this is less about the keywords that we're using and more about the convention, right? And making sure that everything matches up. Conventionally, we'll use index, new, create, show, edit, update, and destroy. Okay, we've gotten all the way to views. We have basically gotten to the point in our diagram where we've gone through this whole process. And actually, I think there's something I'd like to add now. Y'all see the whiteboard, right? Cool. We've come in through the web browser. Our client has said, I want to go to localhost 3000/tasks. This HTTP request technically doesn't go across the internet because this is a, sorry, what's it called? The local host is called the loopback address. That's not super important to know, but probably worth mentioning because it can be a little bit confusing since we're working all on our own machine. Like we're not really traversing the internet. We're just kind of hopping back to this loopback address on our own computer. But essentially, we go through this whole thing. We get to the server and the first place we hit is the routes. We go to the controller based on what we've defined in the routes. The controller will look something up with the model and active record. Right here, all we're doing is task.all. We assign that to an instance variable in the controller as this message comes back. And then with that instance variable, we're able to print some stuff out in the view. And then the thing that I wanted to add here, if you want to get really technical, you could probably say that the view goes back to the controller and then does some like lower level stuff and goes back. But for the sake of what we're doing in mod 2, the view is just packaged up and sent over to the user. So I'm going to draw an arrow going directly to the HTTP response stage of this lifecycle. And what I will also put here as a label is that this is going to send back specifically a response made of HTML, probably some CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript. And we won't be writing JavaScript in mod 2, but it's good to know that Rails has some built-in JavaScript behavior for the asset pipeline and stuff like that. So that's the kind of stuff that it will send back, which is going to be a document that can be displayed in the web browser and make sense to the user. So that is pretty much the whole flow of how we can expect MVC to work. Does anybody have questions up to this point? And I think I'm going to go back to sharing my terminal because I think it's probably more valuable to look at examples here. Brian.
So slightly different from what you were looking at because we're on index, but for batch, is that why we don't need task as an instance variable, or what the reason behind that is?
Good question. You were saying sorry, which part where we don't need an instance?
On line 15 where you're defining task.
Right.
It's not an instance variable, and I was just wondering why that one particular, now create as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad you brought that up. Does anybody have a guess as to why that would be the case or thoughts? I will definitely talk about it more, but I'm wondering if somebody has noticed like another thing that corresponds with these two actions that don't have an instance variable. Lee?
Is it because it's not actually getting sent to view, it's just communicating with the database?
Yeah, great observation. There is no view being rendered in either of these. So let's see. I should, before I forget, sorry, this is a great train of thought, but I'm gonna fix everything here before I forget. Cool. So for update and for create, as Lee pointed out, we don't actually have any views being rendered. We're overriding the default Rails behavior to render a view that matches the name of the controller method. And the places that we're overriding this is on line 21, or are on line 21 and line 35. Instead of doing the default render, we're doing a redirect, meaning that this is sending a whole new HTTP request to our app, essentially saying, hey, I've done everything I need to do. Take me to this other page. Right. So when we don't have an instance when we don't have a view to print out this information on, as is the case with update and with create, we don't need to set up any instance variables. Does that answer that question, or does anybody have any follow-up? All right. That brings up another thing that I think is good to talk about. Oh, we're at 10 o'clock. Why don't we take a palm here and we'll come back and look at a few more examples in the browser. Let's come back at 10:05. All right. I'd like to get a sense of how challenging or yeah, just how this material is setting with everybody. Could I get feedback in chat? Like, can I get a 0 if this is all still very confusing and overwhelming and you have no idea how to apply it to your project, and like a 5 if you're ready to go like do a full analysis of the MVC in relational Rails right now. In chat, if I could get like 0 to 5, how much sense is this making? How confident do you feel in these concepts? Lots of 3s. Awesome. That's pretty good. I think that's about where I want us to be. A couple 4s. Excellent. Got a 5. We got a 4.25. Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody. That's good. I think that's sufficient for us to maybe kick it up a notch, a 10. Ezzy, I'll just let you teach the class if that's okay. Yeah, let's look at, thinking in my head here for a second, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again and pose a couple of questions to you all, and then we can maybe look at examples and see what's going on. So yeah, I think I'll open this up in case anybody has been really experimenting or pushing their knowledge or reading ahead. Do you have any ideas about where we might get information about an HTTP request being not a GET request, being a post, for instance, or a patch or a delete? Where would we get that information? Or where could we look in our text editor to find an example of an HTTP request that is not a GET? Any brave volunteers or any ideas? Marla?
Well, I know that we were using them in the forms in Task Manager. So I guess for like the edit form, so I guess that would be trying to remember what were the methods that we used. Yeah, I mean, I guess tasks edit or tasks new, either one.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. That's exactly what I was looking for. So to your point, Marla, if we look at our forms, I do want to preface this discussion just by saying, as we move through the mod, we'll be using less raw HTML, and we will strongly encourage you all to use Rails view helpers. And I do think that those are a little bit easier to follow, but this will be a good enough example for what we're talking about today. We have this form here, and the things I want to call out are this method post and value patch pieces on lines 1 and 3. Every form by default is going to be a post. And when we're doing something that we want to classify as something other than a post, it will need to be overridden. And the way that this is done in the raw HTML is by just passing like an input, a hidden input with this special name value of underscore method, and then the value keyword with the value matched up to it of like whatever verb we want to be using. So we mentioned yesterday that the patch verb has to do with editing or updating records. And that's why our form on the edit page is a patch. If we go over to the new form, this doesn't have that hidden input overriding the type, because by default, we want all of our forms to be a post. And that makes sense, right? When we have a form for a new object in our database and we click the submit button, we want that to post to tasks. And when it posts to tasks, then we get mapped to the tasks controller create action. And just to refresh what we talked about a second ago, once we get to the tasks create, we're doing our active, well, this is Ruby here. We're creating a new Ruby object, and then we're calling the active record save. And then instead of rendering anything, we redirect to the tasks index, which means we don't need to have a view associated with the create method. Okay, I think it would probably make even more sense to walk through that again with some binding.pries, and that will be a nice segue into talking about params. So I'm going to put a binding.pry in the update action. I'm going to put one in the create action. And I'm going to go back over to my browser, and the first route that I'm going to hit is 7. I'm going to get tasks new. Just going to refresh to make sure I'm in a good state. And then I think I have to actually go back to localhost 3000 to do this. So actually, the first route that I'm hitting is this route path, the get / to welcome index. And now I can click new task, which does take me to tasks new. And this is rendering this form. If I were to go in here and use my dev tools and inspect, I could actually look at the HTML here in my browser. And if I expand the body and then I expand the form, we see that method post. And of course, all of our other fields, but that's just the thing that I wanted to call out. Close that for now. You can enter a new task. I'll say sweep floor and hit submit. And when I hit submit, I should hit a binding.pry. And I do. So I think this is something that will continue to make more and more sense as you work on these projects and whatnot. But a really good thing to check when you're prying into any controller method is to check your params object. And the params object is hash-like. You can see that we have some sort of special name here, action controller parameters. So this is behavior that we get from active record. And we have this key value pair, like this big string of key value pairs. So we have like an authenticity token. We're not going to worry about that. But then we also have this task object with a title and a description. And then we have some information about which controller we're going to and what method we're going to inside of that controller. Permitted false, we will worry about that later. Not super relevant for this introductory lesson today. But this means that if I want to access the actual value that I want to use as the title for this new task, I can use hash syntax, right? If you think back to nested collections in mod 1, you probably had a lot of practice doing stuff like this, where I look at this hash and I see the outer, this outer key is task, and then I have a hash as the value for that key. And in that hash has two pairs. It has a title of sweep, the description of sweep the floor. So I'm trying to access title. That should work, I think. Did I get everything right? There we go. And so later on in the controller, what you'll see us doing is accessing this value in our params object and assigning it to the title attribute of our new task. Let's look at another. Okay, so then I exited out of that pry and it did add this and redirect us to the index. So another example of this kind of behavior is I can go to the edit and I'll say sweep the floor again or whatever and click submit. And now I should hit the pry here in the update action. And if I check out my params object, I get something looking very similar, but now you'll notice I do have this method patch. And in the task, I have the same title, but now the description has changed. And that's what I'll be updating my existing task with. I exit. I want to go back to my browser and see that that change has saved, and it has. So that's a brief introduction to the params object. It will become, I think the params object is something that you'll want to become very comfortable with, especially for debugging. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. This is kind of an open-ended question for y'all, but do you have any questions about this whole process of getting a form, posting from that form, using the params object in your controller action, and then saving either the new or the updated record? Is that all making sense? Caroline.
I'm sorry, I think you said this already, but could you repeat what the patch part is doing?
Sure. And that's fine. I'm happy to repeat anything that we need more clarification on. So when you're saying, can I go into more detail about what patch is doing? Are you, yeah, I guess I'll just mention both of these. So we have patch here on line 13 of our routes file. And we also need to define that this is going to be a patch in our actual form because the forms are going to default to post. And if we think back to what we talked about yesterday with HTTP requests and responses, patch and put are the HTTP verbs associated with editing or updating a record. So we have this form basically saying, look, this is an edit form. I want to change something about a record that already exists. I'm going to define that as a patch for that reason, because I'm no longer creating something, I'm updating it. And because of that, this HTTP request will be interpreted by the routes file as a patch to whatever this, I think I forgot to mention this actually, so I'm glad we're revisiting, whatever this URL is, or this URI, I should say. So in the edit, it's this URI, it includes the task ID. I think I want to spend some time in a little bit talking about how that works, but essentially we have this, this URI, we have a HTTP verb, and then the routes file can interpret that request by saying, yeah, I can pattern match to this patch request to tasks ID, and I can send it to tasks update. And that's what allows us to run the correct code, right? That's what allows us to actually do this update operation. Can I clarify any further on that, Caroline, or did that answer your question?
That answered my question. Thank you.
Great. And I think I saw another hand up. Marla.
Just kind of a follow-up with that. In the edit, you're setting, in the edit view, sorry, you're setting the name as task and then square brackets title. Is that telling like the param what key the title is going to be set at, or no, the value is? I guess I'm a little confused on how we're communicating that info to the parameter.
Yeah, great question. And unfortunately, I think this is more difficult to understand in raw HTML than it is with our Rails view helpers. I think it'll be a lot more clear then. But to answer your question, yes, that's exactly what's happening. This is going to turn into our key, or really it's creating a nested key value pair here, which is, we don't need to worry about that too much. It will get easier with the form helpers that we'll be introducing soon, or that I think you probably have already been using in the setlist tutorial. But yes, this is basically setting the key in that params object, and the value of that key is what we put here. It's like the value of the input will be associated with whatever name this is. That'll create the key value pair in the params object.
Okay.
Did that get to your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm just having a hard time still fully connecting it. It's very loose, but it's there.
Gotcha. Okay. Maybe if we have time, if you don't mind, like if you want, you can put a reminder for me in the Jamboard about the MVC class, and maybe we can look at an example in setlist, which has, I think, a more straightforward form to talk about this with.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, just adding on to that. So in line 5, where the name is task bracket title, is that because you can access the param object via string or symbol syntax? So that's how it's able to set that kind of key value pair on line 5?
That's my assumption, yes. The params object should be a hash-like object that's accessible with either string or symbol syntax. So it would make sense to me that that's why this is working. Let me actually, I think maybe for both of these questions, let's do the edit. I'm finding that right here. And I'll keep this open and I'll go in my browser to this, I'll refresh. And when I push, actually, let me inspect this. Maybe this will provide a little bit more clarity. And I expand this form. And then here I have this input. It's a text input, which means we can expect a string. The name of this input field is task square bracket title. So if we think about this as the params object that this is going to turn into, this will be a nested hash-like object. And then the value is whatever I type in here. So if I go in here and I type, I don't know, vacuum. I don't know how to spell vacuum, but that will change when I push submit. Right here, I'm just gonna put it back to sweep so that we don't like get confused. But then when I push submit, we can take a look at what this actually created as far as the params object. I can say params. And the idea here, I think the reason that we have this as a string of task square bracket title is so that we can pull a task object out of our params object by doing this params task. And I think looking at it this way makes a little bit more sense. Now we have, we have the task description and the task title. They pretty much look like attributes on an object already, even though this is a params object. But yeah, that's kind of what's going on there. The name here is going to become the key, or in this case, a nested hash, and the keys in that nested hash, task and title, and task and description. And then the value in the form input becomes the value of the key value pair that we get to in the params object. Taylor, does that get to what you were asking?
Yep, sorry, I forgot to lower my hand.
No, you're good.
Thank you. Perfect.
Sure, just wanted to make sure. Marla?
Just following up on that.
Sure.
So then when we're doing this on our own project, task, we put the controller name there, like the name of our controller before the title, or is it the name of the database? Because the database is plural, right?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a good question. One of the trickiest things I think about learning Rails is getting the pluralization and the naming conventions committed to memory. You'll notice here that the controller is also plural. Let's see, what can I say about that? Yeah, so for controllers, for routes, typically we're going to be using all plurals. For the form, I'm trying to decide how into the weeds I want to get here. But yeah, for now, I'll just say that for like the form, we're editing one task. We're creating one task. So I would expect these to be singular. And then another thing that I'll point out while we're talking about it is that the models are also singular. Task.rb, class task.
Okay, so we should think of it as though it's like connecting to the model in some sort of way. I mean, I know not directly, but the syntax of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that that makes sense to me. And then the only caveat I have to that is that in the views, your directory for those views will be plural because this has to match the name of the controller. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
So.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. Great questions. Keep them coming. But for now, I'm going to pause and talk about something else in the routes file that we haven't gotten to yet. And that is, we'll cover it in more detail, like a lot of things. But I do want to start mentioning how the dynamic segments work in the routes file. So for most of these are static. We're matching to a very specific string of /tasks. That's never going to change. /tasks /new, also never going to change. That's all static. But when we start getting down here to, for example, line 10, and we have what looks like a symbol to us as Rubyus, in the routes DSL, this indicates a dynamic segment. We can think of this as a variable or a wildcard. And this means that anything I put in tasks / whatever, the routes file will be like, oh yeah, that matches. I'm going to go to the tasks controller show action. And then it will try to look up, because we have here on line 7 of the controller, it will try to look up a task by whatever we passed in as that param. So I think it's easier to demonstrate than it is to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and try this. I'm going to go to, I know that I have a task of 1, 2, and 3. I'm just going to go to localhost 3000 tasks 2. And I would expect this to take me to the show page for the second task in my database. And it does. So what's happening there? Actually, could I get a brave volunteer to walk me through what happens when I, as a user, go to this URL and I push enter? In your own words, what happens? Can somebody raise their hand and walk me through that? Well, first question, you only have to answer this part. When I hit enter, what does that do? D.
So when you hit enter, you're gonna send a request to the routes, which then will send it to the controller.
Awesome. Can I push a little further on that and ask you how? When we get to the routes file, how does it know to send me to the controller? And to reiterate, the path I went to was localhost 3000 tasks.
So task is the controller name, and the 1 represents the ID.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you. So that's what I was hoping to get at here. When we get this HTTP request, it goes to the routes file and it knows to go to the tasks controller show action, because this first it matches the static segment. Well, let me back up. First, it says this is a GET request. It's not get slash tasks. It's not get slash tasks slash new. It's not post. It's not get. Oh, wait, we have a get. We have tasks as our static segment. And then we have 1, which could fit here. Anything could be this. This colon ID means that this is a wildcard value. This could be 1. This could be 100. This could be 500. This could be alpaca. Right? So that's a wildcard value. Let me take another volunteer. If I were to put a binding.pry here, let me see, what's the best way to ask this question? Yeah, I think that's what I'm going to do. I put a binding.pry there and I hit enter. We expect to hit that pry because of what Dee and I just walked through. If I call params ID, somebody raise their hand so that they can tell me, what do you expect to be returned from this in my terminal, in my pry session? Anybody have a guess as to what will be returned if I hit enter now in my pry session? Okay, let's find out together. So if I do that, I get back 1. This means that on line 8 in my tasks controller, I can run task.find params ID, basically saying, hey, active record, find the task with the ID of 1. And that's what I get back. And this is what's sent to the view to display the information on the show page, right? The great thing about dynamic segments in routes is that this can be anything. We get at that by calling it a dynamic segment. This can be any ID that we want to display. The terrible thing about this is that this can be anything, right? So if I got out of this pry, I went over here, I did, and I go back over to my pry and I say params ID. So the name of the key in the params hash in this case is whatever we called this, for lack of a word, variable. This dynamic segment ID is the key. And then the value would be what I put in my browser. So it's alpaca. So if I do that, couldn't find task with ID alpaca. So this doesn't just apply to like strings or words that you put in for fun. This could mean like maybe you're trying to access an actual task with like an ID of 500 and it doesn't exist, and you would get this error back. And we would also get that error in the browser. Cool. Any questions about the dynamic segments in the routes file before we move on? Elliot?
I was wondering, so you like in a like real, not like in the Rails server, like it's on like a real website, you're to go to a page where the ID doesn't exist. Is that where like a 404 error comes in, or?
Can be, yeah. We'll talk more about the different status codes in HTTP later on in the mod, and you'll definitely talk about them more in mod 3. But yeah, usually when you try to go to something that doesn't exist, the error that you'll get back or the error that the website will send back to you is a 404 or a 500. That's another really common one for something that's like broken. Typically, you'll see 404 if something isn't found or if you put in like a bad URL. And that's up to the backend team, whether they want to show you the 404 or something more useful or show you nothing at all. There are conventions around it, but yeah.
Thanks.
Sure. What other questions do you all have? Okay. Why don't we take a palm and come back at, let's say 10:37. All right, I have one quick activity for you all to try with the remainder of class time, unless there are any other questions. I don't see questions on the Jamboard right now about the Intro to MVC class, but is there anything else we can clarify or talk about more before I send you out into pairs to do an activity? Elliot.
I was just wondering on convention for just creating the files themselves. Like, does it make most sense to just like start like make the routes file first, then go into the controller, create the controller, then the model, then the view? Or is there any reason you do it like kind of a different order?
Right. So when it comes to creating the actual files in your project, some of them will be created for you and some of them you will have to create, like your models and your controllers. Routes will already exist when you start your project, and maybe a few other things. Most of them you will have to go in and create yourself. And the way that I would recommend, the order I would recommend tackling those in is start with your tests. We'll get into a feature testing lesson later today. And with that information, you can start with the test and then the errors can drive what you write next. So the first error you'll get most of the time will be no route matches, etc. And then you can go to your routes file and add the route. And then the next thing will probably be no controller exists or whatever. And that way the errors are always telling you the next step in the process if you have a good test.
Yeah, cool.
Cool. Let's take 15 minutes and I'll share my screen. So if you have the introduction to MVC lesson plan open from the calendar event, there is a section down here called experiment. And there are two challenges here. Add a new route and view so the user can successfully visit localhost 3000/Easter egg and see a new view of your choice. The second is add a new route so the user can go to localhost 3000/show me the tasks and be directed to all of the tasks. For task number 2, you should not have to create a new view. So I'm going to go ahead and open some breakout rooms. These should all be pairs. So what I would recommend is doing driver navigator, having one person tackle driving the first experiment here and have one person tackle driving the second experiment. And we'll take about 15 minutes to do that. Any questions about what I'm asking you to do? Okay, I'm opening up those breakout rooms now. Unless, Elliot, you had another question, right? Or is that from before?
Jameson, we learned a valuable lesson in terms of controller
Naming.
naming, so that was good.
Awesome. Care to share? Oh, what happened?
Yeah, well, I'll just share real quick.
Go for it.
So we learned that if you have like a multiple word controller, when we did the camel case here, we did not have an underscore separating here, nor did we have one separating here. And then it wasn't able to actually find that action in that view. So once we changed it to snake case here, here, and here, that resolved it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I think it's an easy thing to run into, and it demonstrates like good debugging that you were able to follow your errors and find where you had to rename things. In general, it's good to try and like apply that everywhere. If you are using a naming convention in Pascal case, like you would for a controller class name or any class name, it's good to try and translate that to using underscores and turning it into snake case wherever that's appropriate. Nice, thanks for sharing. Yeah, for the sake of time, I think the last thing I wanted to ask is if anybody has an idea about this, I should share my screen. Make sure everybody sees what I'm looking at. Note for, or let's also talk quickly about why the second path isn't a good idea. Why would you not actually want to build this kind of functionality exactly as you did? Anybody have an idea? Creating a route that does nothing but redirect, is that very dry? Yeah,
Nope.
That's the main thing that comes to mind for me. And the other thing to just like a snippet, a teaser for later on is that we have conventions to follow in our routes file that are called restful routes that we want to create. And that's just another one of those things where Rails and the Rails community has a certain way that things are generally expected to be done. And a custom link like, or a custom URL like this that does nothing but redirect to an index is not conventional. So that would be the other reason, but wanted to address that in case it caught anybody's eye during that activity. Great, that's all I have for lesson material today. Thank you all for being here for this 2-hour lesson. Next up, we have office hours. So if there are any questions that came up during that activity or questions that you have about the homework videos, this would be a great time to go over that stuff. I guess the last thing I'll say is if you haven't had a chance to complete those homework videos or at least watch them once or twice, even if you didn't code along, I definitely recommend making sure to stay on top of those. They're really meant to provide code examples that you can follow along with that will be a demonstration of the kind of things that you'll need to know of and be aware of for your projects. And that way we don't have to spend class time with me just talking at you as much. So definitely look into those homework videos on the calendar if you haven't already. But other than that, you all are free to go and have more work time right now if you'd like, or stick around for office hours and just raise your hand if you have questions. And with that, we'll go to Brian.
Just wondering if I went through the videos and I started watching nights as well. At any point, are we going to be referencing, like, 'cause I just sort of started off like, oh, I'll just do paper notes because I'll make it stick in my head. And then now I'm like 3 videos in and I don't have any code. At any point in class or anything?
You kind of cut out there at the end, but I think you were asking if at any point we're going to be looking at this code in class. And to answer that, yes, there may be some lessons that reference set list in particular. If you look ahead in the lessons on the backend page, you might find that they are linked to a different set list repo. It's a very, very similar repo. We just have like 2 separate ones on Archer and GitHub. One that is just lesson plan code and stuff, and those have branches that you can check out. So if you have been following along and taking notes with the homework videos and you don't have any code of your own, that's okay. You might feel more comfortable going through the videos again and trying to code along. That might be valuable practice for you. But in those classes, we will also have branches to check out. So you can pull down a branch with the code that you would need to follow along with the lesson. Yeah. Cool. I see your message in chat, Brian. Thank you. Let's go to Taylor.
Yeah, I just had a question on model testing.
Mhm.
I haven't really found or built any custom methods yet. So really, is model testing only required when you have custom methods built in to your models?
Yes, that is the biggest use case for model testing. I think we mentioned in another class, like the things that we're calling on models, like for example, in today's lesson, the task.find, that's already tested behavior through the active record dependency. But as we move through the mod, and I think those videos are a great example of this too, there will be things to test in the model tests like relationships and validations. And if you haven't gotten to that point yet, totally fine. We'll have more classes on that tomorrow and the next day, I believe. So those are a couple of other things that could live in model tests, even if you don't have any custom defined behavior.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Antonio?
Yeah, mine is just kind of piggybacking off of Taylor. I just wanted to be sure. So a lot of this work in the beginning with setting up Rails is pretty much set up, and you're not really writing tests for any of that. You're just following the errors until I guess you potentially can view and communicate properly. And then once you start adding to the models is when we start writing more tests for that and following a different TDD.
Yeah, so good question. And I think this afternoon's lesson on feature testing will answer that in more detail, because there's a little bit of just basic configuration and setup that you'll need to do when you create a new Rails app. And there are some things that won't need to be tested. But then the moment that you start creating any kind of custom behavior, like going to /tasks and seeing all the tasks listed on the page, that is something that you can feature test. And we'll get into that this afternoon. And really, I would expect that most of the stuff that you're doing when you first start working on a project or a challenge or whatever would be driven by feature tests at the beginning, until you start needing to get into that more complex data logic behavior, at which point you'd need custom methods on your models, meaning you'd have to go write tests for those as well.
Okay, perfect, thanks.
Sure. Matt.
Yes, while we were working on relational Rails, my partner and I encountered a few errors and some possible solutions to them. One of the solutions being there was this duplicate column error, and he actually found that one of the ways that he could address that, instead of going through the whole process of designing all of those changes, like it's been suggested in Stack Overflow posts, how you create incremental changes in the code to account for what you want to correct for. So let's say misspellings, for example, by deleting a database and then remigrating after recreating a table. So that was one solution. So as a first question, I just wanted to know if that is a valid solution, or if we want to avoid doing that as much as possible.
Yeah, let me make sure I'm understanding your scenario appropriately. So what I'm hearing is that you have like an issue with one of the column names. Maybe you have two columns of the same name, and you just can't run the migrations. And your question is, could you run something like Rails DB drop and then change those migrations to be what you want, and then run Rails DB create and Rails DB migrate and be in a good spot? Is that kind of like along the lines of what you're asking?
That's very close.
Okay.
I think
Pretty
that the
much
way
what
that we
happened.
had thought through it was, he might be able to describe it a little bit better because he's my partner. He ran into the error that I did not.
It was pretty much that I'd put the foreign ID, like I typed it out and put it into the table. And then when I migrated the table, since it already existed and I was trying to create that ID, or that row, I think, column, my bad. It just wouldn't do it. So just deleted the tables with Rails drop, changed the actual file itself to take that row out, and then just did a create and a migrate. So yeah, that was what happened.
Cool. Yeah, I don't necessarily have a super cut and dry answer, but a couple things I'll mention is rather than like going into something like Postico or PSQL in the terminal and like manually deleting a table that way, I would recommend doing the Rails DB drop create migrate. that is a fine process. Where that might raise concern for me is if you had, this probably won't happen in Mod 2, but if you had more than like a dozen migrations and you run like the 13th migration and there's something wrong with the first or second one, and then you have to like drop your database and go fix that first or second migration and then try to run them all in the same order, I think that could get really gnarly really quickly. So if that were happening to that degree where you had to drop your database and change migrations that were from like not recent history, but further back, that would raise concerns. That would just make me think that the migrations were never in a good state to begin with. And you would really have to go through and audit each one and make sure they're still running in the right order, et cetera. So, but the short answer is doing a Rails DB drop, create, migrate, if you're running into that type of issue, is almost always fine and safe, especially because we're just working with development right now. That's something you would never want to do in production. Yeah. But that's okay. Like, and definitely I would prefer that to doing multiple rollbacks in a row, because that can also cause some unexpected behavior. Does that kind of get to what y'all were asking?
That almost fully answers my question. The second part of my question was that I simply have one error that I ran into. It didn't stop anything in the console until I realized, looking at the schema, that I had included the ID that was meant to be a foreign key, but not realizing that it was going to create the foreign key automatically when I created that association. So now I have grocery store ID and grocery stores ID, and grocery stores was created automatically. And I went back through my terminal history and saw that, yeah, I typed it out the way that I thought was correct, but then it gave me this plural foreign key that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, and I guess if you have something that you could share on your screen that we could look at.
I can definitely share it.
Yeah, thank you. Let's do that. Because I would expect you to be able to define what that foreign key is with like the references syntax, if that makes sense. So I would expect it to be grocery store ID probably. I think the convention would be for it to be singular because it only references one grocery store, you know?
That was my thought on the matter. And here's what it was typed out as an integer. And I was assuming that using the reference was going to call that, but instead it auto-generated grocery stores ID, it seems, as big int. And now I have two columns. When I look at the database, it actually does show two different things.
Yeah, so this might not answer every question around this. I think the Active Record Associations class and others will probably go into more detail, but what I'll quickly say is that if y'all are running migrations and trying to set up these relationships and the foreign key and stuff like that, you don't need to manually create that integer column and then also create a grocery store references, for instance. Just so that like one command will do it for you. Yep. So if you were to run that migration and then open up the migration file before running Rails DB migrate and say, oh, you could probably edit it. Like if it said, if your migration had the plural grocery stores, you could just change that to be singular and then run your migration and everything else should still work the same. Like the foreign key should still be set up the way that you want, but it is important to note that you wouldn't want to create an additional integer column called grocery store ID. You would let the references syntax do that for you.
Okay, so was following the artists in the Active Record Associations lesson as plural, was it proper for me to use grocery stores to groceries? Because I believe that using this syntax while following that lesson might have produced this kind of unexpected grocery store thing. But the reason I did it is because I noticed that artists in the lesson plan was pluralized.
Yeah, I think I would refer to the lesson plan as the source of truth. Like if I were to go through and build this out and I had a migration and I was like, I'm not sure if that should be plural or singular. That's one that, like with migrations, especially the pluralization still trips me up, and I've been doing this for like three plus years. So I would reference the lesson plan as the source of truth. And if that does give you any like unexpected bugs that you think have to do with pluralization, we should have a conversation about it in code help. But yeah, trust the lesson plan over my memory on the pluralization for migrations.
Okay.
Cool. Is that everything?
Yeah, that's it.
Sweet. All right. Thanks for sharing. Let's go to Brian and then we'll go to Karina.
I just still trying to figure out this issue where I don't know if you can hear me because my internet keeps cutting in and out, but
You sound good so far.
okay. So the actual ID numbers continue to go up and up and up, and I'm trying to figure out how to like have them get reset at this. You know what I mean? Basically at the start of like so many times that I'm at like 100 and something, and I'd like to be able to, like when I go to the test URL, I don't want it to be like 125. I'd like to, state 2.
So just based on that, I won't ask you to screen share right now because I know you're having internet trouble. But what I would recommend looking into is if this is referring to your tests, especially, see if there's any way that you can dynamically reference those IDs instead of like statically typing out something /2, because I think we mentioned this before, but I'll go into it again. Like it's counterintuitive to me, like even when I'm writing my tests and I'm trying to put integers in there. But Postgres is trying to protect you. It's trying to keep incrementing up and up and up. And that's actually expected behavior that you would have like in a test, the ID would be 3,405 or something like that. And what I would recommend is in your expectations, have a variable that stores the ID that you're expecting and call that rather than call it like hard coding in the integer. But if it seems like what I'm saying doesn't like match up with the behavior you're noticing, then we can definitely follow up in code help. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I think it's a disconnect in my head between the development database and the test database, and I'm not sure if that's where I'm getting confused. So I'll keep looking at it and trying to figure out a way to get it reset. I'm definitely looking into dynamically getting it on the testing side. But when I run the test, I don't, just sort of I just want it to look bad. I don't want it to be running, all the way. I don't have 125 states. I have 2, and I'd like to have that get reset as it goes through it. And that's wondering, like coding wise, I don't know if that was in like the seed file thing, but I know that would be the development database. So yeah, I'm not entirely certain about it.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think let's revisit this conversation after the feature testing lesson, especially if it's still an issue. Because I think maybe if we look at some more specific examples on how to set up our tests and verify what data we have in the test database in that moment, maybe it will resolve itself on your end. Yeah, but I think like the feature test lesson might have more valuable information to help you with that, with like sorting out those tests and ID issues and all that stuff. Cool.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you. Karina.
This is more just like convention in terms of adding a few things to our tables. So originally when I set up mine, I typed out as I was setting it up, like create at and update at with the time, but then kind of going through the videos, it gets added after with the timestamps. Is timestamps more of the convention to do that rather than manually? And then same with the foreign key. I added it during that initial setup for for that table with the reference portion of that. Would it be more conventional to do the Rails migrate, add whatever to whatever piece of it?
For that piece, do you have it handy? Could you share your screen?
Yeah, let me get it pulled up, and I can show my schema, and I did this a few days ago, but
yeah, that would be great.
For this, wait, did I share the right one? Can you see my
vegetable garden?
Yeah. Okay. So it did the foreign keys down here, but when I added it, I just typed it in manually up here.
You typed it in manually to the schema file or to your migration?
No, when I was setting up this table, I did the, rather than running that migrate separately. I don't have the syntax. Properly.
Gotcha.
The one that what Matt was showing.
Cool. Could we take a, could you open up your migration file for this where you added the foreign key? Yeah, I think this is, if you didn't run it in like the generator in the terminal, like references colon whatever, or whatever colon references, it's fine to add it in manually here, especially if you go to your schema and verify like you just did that you have the foreign key and the index that you expect.
Okay.
Nothing wrong with that. The generator is really just a shortcut.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. What other questions do y'all have? I don't see any other hands up right now. Yeah, Brian, if you feel like your internet connection could handle a screen share, I'm happy to take a closer look at that testing stuff now and until somebody else has a different question. We also have Michael.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about just convention in the routes file. Is organization in there? Is there a specific convention for, like, do you put all the gets together? You know, do you keep them separated that way? Or is there any other like kind of standard way to kind of organize?
Yeah, there are a couple of things I'll say there. I think the biggest convention is to group them by the resource that they refer to. So put all the task routes together and then maybe add some blank space if you had like a days of the week resource or something like that, then you would group all the days of the week resources together. The other thing to be aware of is that I'll try to describe this the best I can, but y'all let me know if an example would be helpful. If you have a static route that is exactly like a dynamic route, for instance, if you have tasks new, get tasks new, and then you have get tasks ID as a dynamic segment, you could get into a state where if you had the get tasks ID first and you tried to go to get tasks new, your app would actually try to look up a record with the ID of new, if that makes sense. Here, how about I demonstrate that? This is like a common gotcha. So I think for those of us who are still on the call, it's probably worth going over. Here I am in Task Manager, and we have tasks new comes first, which is the way I would recommend doing it in this case, because we want this will be the one that will be more strict, right? It will only match to this route if you literally type in localhost 3000/tasks/new. But watch what happens if I put this route, which is very similar. It has a dynamic segment instead of having the static new segment. If I put this here and my server's running, and then I try to go to localhost, and what I want is a form for a new task, right? Oh, I'm still in a binding.py. Well, this is actually valuable. So if I put params ID, I don't get an ID, I get new. And that means that I get this error, couldn't find task with ID of new. And the reason for this, again, is that anything that looks like a symbol here, this can be whatever you put in. It's a wildcard. So I typed in this, but the routes file matched it to line 6 because technically that's correct, right? And when it matched it to line 6, it went to the tasks controller show action, and it tried to look up a task by params ID. Remember, in our params object, this is a key, and then whatever we actually type into our browser is, for this segment, is the value. So it tried to find a task with the keyword new instead of finding one with an ID. So I would just recommend keeping an eye, like if you're getting this and you don't understand why this isn't an ID, why it's something else, or why it seems to be trying to go to the wrong controller action, keep an eye on your dynamic segments. That's an error that has bitten me a few times, and it's very frustrating until you get used to recognizing what it is. Did that make sense? Any questions on that?
So
No,
routes,
made sense, yeah.
routes trump all. Is that correct?
What do you mean by that?
So the order of the methods in the controller wouldn't help you there. It's the order of the routes
Right.
that directs the application.
Yeah, exactly. So when your HTTP request comes in and you get to the routes file, it will go line by line and look for something that matches. And it does that before it can get to a controller, because the routes file is telling you which controller to go to.
Got it. Thank you. And sorry, Michael, didn't mean to step on your toes there. My bad.
No, all good. I was just saying it made sense, and that's good to know. I haven't ran into that issue yet, but I'm sure I will. So it's
Yeah.
good to see that.
Thanks for that question. I know that was like more of an answer than you were probably like asking for, but for your original question, I would say like I just separated these for readability today, but if this were like a real project, this is probably, oops, this is probably what I would consider conventional. You have like all of your tasks routes grouped together, and then you have like your welcome route grouped up here. So, and there are more things to talk about as far as routing, like different syntaxes and stuff, but for now we're only using the hand rolled routes. So.
And since I'm partners with Michael, can I go ahead and show you like our routes? It's super, super small, super judgment.
Yeah, go for it.
But let's see. So with what you said, it's fine to keep these together, or should I have like a space? And then if I were to add stuff that's particular for like the game studios, have it kind of bunched together, and the same thing for this one?
That's how I would do it. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think there's any like strict rule, but I do feel that you'll be making your life easier if you group your routes together by what resource they are.
Okay, awesome.
Taylor.
Any shortcuts possibly you'd recommend to seed the database with the children specifically? I was thinking of like putting things into a CSV and then parsing that in. And I just figured maybe there's a better way or a shortcut, but just wanted to ask about that.
Have you already looked into the seeds file?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's probably the most straightforward way. And the way that would work would be that you would set these things up like very similar to how you would in a test, right? And then to populate your database with those seeds, you would run Rails. After you've migrated, you would run Rails DB seed. And I think that's the most straightforward way. You could probably get really meta with it and have like some script that does something similar, but I think that's probably more effort than it's worth. And the other benefit of a seeds file is that can be pushed up to version control, and your project partner can pull that down and actually populate their development database with the same mock data that you have.
Got it. So the seed file is basically the resource that all partners can kind of utilize the same data directly from Git, and you don't have to manually, add everything into the database basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
because
cool.
As we mentioned before, like the database is separate from your Rails app. You're not going to be pushing your database up to version control, but you can push up a lot of different instructions that get you all on the same page.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. And I may have said this already, but like I'm happy to help debug project issues during these office hours too, especially if we've gotten to all the lesson material questions. So if y'all have things that you're running into that just don't make a lot of sense, happy to take a look.